After I had finished the structural work on my workshop, I could start with the inner workings. The heart of a local workshop is often the workbench, with which I wanted to start. It will be about 7 meters long and will lead through a corner. The legs should be angled so that one would not get their feet stuck on it and have more space underneath. I thought about different variations how to make such a long board. In the end, I decided to use beams made of cheap softwood. On the one hand, this is cheap. On the other hand, using construction beams would enable me to interlock several plates with each other in order to get the desired length. Since coniferous wood is very soft, I will screw a top layer of MDF boards onto these beams. This will not only make a harder surface, but I'll also be able to easily exchange single plates in case they get damaged. I bought construction beams of 3 meters length in the local DIY store. My workbench should have a depth of about 80 centimeters. The beams are 78 millimeters wide, so 10 beams will give me 78 centimeters depth. If the MDF plates add a couple of centimeters at the end, I'm at the desired 80 centimeters. So 10 beams in total for 80 centimeters depth and 3 meters long workbench. But the long side of the workbench will be 5 meters long, so I'll need 20 beams. And I also got myself some basic equipment. So in order to glue the beams together, you'll need clamps that can span about 80 centimeters. And a lot of them. Since this would exceed my budget, I made a few clamps myself. After I finished a few of them, I noticed I can also simply use lashing straps. They work well enough, are cheap and fast. However, the lashing straps have the disadvantage of pushing the wood in at the edges and damaging it. To prevent this, I first made an edge protector. And after it proven itself, a few more. Wood warps differently depending on how its rings run. I tried to keep this in mind when orienting the beams, so that the plate does not bulge too much or even tear later. Construction wood is of course not straight as a candle, but rather serpentine. I already picked out the best pieces in the DIY store, but I still had to straighten the coarsest curves. A mark on the plate will help me to put it back exactly as planned later. I used a little bit too much glue and immediately ruined my freshly painted floor. Dried glue can't be really removed anymore. I let the whole thing dry overnight, and the next day I had a bonded sheet. I had to smoothen it out before I could start with the extensions. I did not glue together the second part as a whole, but added the beams piecemeal to the existing plate. This was necessary, firstly so that the construction would hold together at all, and secondly because the deep joints in the wood would have made interlocking two sheets very difficult. It's already difficult with single beams. Aside from that, I could use normal clamps, at least in the beginning. And I used up a lot of glue. This cost me almost as much as the wood itself. Of course the plate was crooked, but even if MDF boards cover it later, this is too much. I had to come up with something. I didn't want to plane everything by hand, neither I have a machine for it. I do, however, have a router. I would be able to put it on a straight template over the workbench, miling the surface straight. The template would have to lie on a smooth surface for this, something like a concrete floor. In its present state, the slab is only held together by glue. This is a very stable connection, but I wanted some cross buttons so that it would warp less. For this purpose, depressions would have been miled into the bottom, in which I would later put counterbeams. I could then easily attach the legs to these counterbeams. The workbench is later screwed onto a beam that sits on the wall. In order for it to lie flat on the wall, the counterbeams must not run through the workbench completely. However, this causes the problem that later the complete weight would only rest on one gluing. Therefore, I reinforced the plate with 20 cm long screws. I had first cut the beams to the complete widths, so now I still had to shorten them. Like I said before, the legs should stand diagonally and touch the wall in the corner. I wanted the workbench to be about 90 cm high. This is the standard height of worktops in kitchens. With some calculating, I got a leg length of about 1 meter. The legs should reach into the workbench with a classic mortise and tenon joint. This way it ends up completely bump-proof. I milled out the cones in the length and then precisely worked them out with a chisel. I made the matching slots in the counterbeams the same way. The workbench has become extremely heavy by now, making it next to impossible to move. It is no longer possible without help. The wall consists of hollow bricks. In order to ensure a secure hold, I bought some extra long and thick mounting screws. Accordingly, the screws were too long, so they came through the wall at the short side of the workbench. Drauf und jetzt schieben.
Geil.
Tada.
Danke.
Okay.
Achtung.
So.
Wenn du hast. Hier ein bisschen.
Applying some more load so that the glue dries in the correct position. Now the short side of the workbench is still missing. For this, I went shopping again. And to make planing easier for me, I bought a jointer on eBay. The machine is 20 years old, but still does its job wonderfully. This way, the beams are going to get so straight and smooth that they will fit well together. This time I put some newspapers under the beams to protect the floor from the glue. The short side is going to receive two counter beams again. But this time I didn't mill the recess but sawed them. This was much faster and the edges came out smoother and straighter. With my router I then smoothed the underside. The short side is about 1.5 meters long, but I didn't have any beams in the right length to screw them to the wall. But I also didn't want to go to the DIY store anymore, so I took the opportunity to try my hand at the classic leafing, for which I still had enough short pieces of wood. This time, however, I was clever enough to put indentations in the beam instead of shortening the counter beams. This way, the entire weight will go through the counter beams on the wall without straining the gluing in the direction of the wood fiber. Lastly, I planed the workbench again and gave it a rough sanding to get a flat surface. The strokes you can see here mark the screws that I had put in. Finally, I connected each of the MDF plates with 4 screws to the workbench. Now the workbench is finished. Next on my list is the French cleat system.